264 Lincoln Douglas debaters began this week on Monday morning. That translates over this past week to 967 discrete debates and 2,127 ballots. After all of that, we are left with these two young people. Debating the resolution resolved, radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice. On the affirmative, the code is 490, and on the negative, the code is 498. Have a great round and good luck.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank a couple of people. Never in my sweetest dreams did I think I'd make it to this national stage. First, to the NSDA and the hosts of this tournament for providing me with the opportunity to partake in such an amazing activity. I'd like to thank my team, specifically Danielle for doing so many practice rounds with me before we got here, Mina for being my moral support and a great friend on this trip, Sabi for his funny stories and words of encouragement, and my coaches, Mark and Joe, for prepping with me before each round. I want to thank my family, especially my mom, who believed in me from the beginning, and I know is always proud of me. My grandma, my sister Bubbles, and my brother Isaac, and my dad. I want to thank a couple of teachers who have made this an incredible year for me. My AP US History teacher, Mr. Simpson, and my AP US Literature teacher, Ms. Benson. And lastly, I want to thank all of the radical activists, and specifically the animal rights activists out there for inspiring me. You are the ones demanding social justice, the most worthy goal of them all. And are my judges ready? My opponents ready? Okay. With that, I will begin my 6 minutes, starting now. I affirm resolved, radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice. I offer the following definitions. Radicalism, Buttigieg 17. Radicalism is more closely linked to a progressive reformism than to extremism, whose violence radicals rejected. Academic consensus definition of radicalism. Radicalism refers to a political doctrine favoring collective freedom, emancipation from hierarchically structured societies, and advocating sweeping political change towards greater democracy. Incrementalism is defined by Collins Dictionary as the theory that change should be introduced gradually or by increments. I value social justice defined as the principle that all members of society have equal rights and opportunities. My criterion is minimizing oppression. Social justice should be first and foremost concerned with oppressed members of society. Rawls argues in his A Theory of Justice that the institutions of society favor certain starting places over others. These are especially deep inequalities to which the principles of social justice must in the first instance apply. He continues that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. Contention 1, moral atrocities demand urgent radical change. Subpoint A, slavery. The founders took an incremental approach on slavery which failed and led to its expansion. Brooks and Starks write in their 2019 book, African Americans and the Presidents. Founding fathers did not believe it was opportune time to end slavery. A bill proposed by Jefferson called for an incremental approach to ending slavery. The Three-Fifths Compromise settled the disagreement. President Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The number of slave and non-slave states was balanced. Monroe believed that eliminating slavery would divide the country. And incrementalism was used as a tool to sanitize slavery's image and spread its evils in the Western territories. Dirk Sheed 14. Rather than turning to radical solutions to end slavery, South Carolinians looked to improve it. Improvement encompassed pragmatic solutions, improvements of slaves' material conditions. Amelioration envisioned slavery shorn of its evils. Mitigated slavery was a dynamic worldview which served as a model that could be replicated within South Carolina and outside. But incrementalism on slavery was fundamentally unjust, Emberton 17. Compromise on slavery was not only unlawful, but sinful. Why do we continue to champion compromise when it was so long used to further the cause of human injustice? Subpoint B, climate change. Climate change is the defining moral issue of the century. It worsens every form of inequality. Cho 20. Communities of color are hardest hit by climate change because of limited access to resources. Higher temperatures lead to more deaths, illnesses, hospital visits, and birth defects. Mortality rates were highest for Black infants. Extreme weather events cause injury, illness, and death. Disadvantaged communities are at risk. Black people are 3 times more likely to die from air pollution. And climate change will kill an uncountable large number this century. Shetty 21. Climate change would cause 83 million excess deaths by 2100. Besser's study accounts only for direct temperature mortality. It leaves out deaths from storms, floods, crop failures, infectious diseases, or wars. Most of the deaths would be in regions that are the hottest and poorest. Incrementalism likewise has failed on climate change, and we don't have much time left. Only radical action can solve. Kaplan and Dennis 4-4. The world will burn through its carbon budget by 2030, putting the goal of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius irrevocably out of reach. It's still technically possible, however, it cannot be achieved through incremental change. Coal use needs to be eliminated within 30 years. With each year that passes, the shifts required to meet targets become even more daunting. And incrementalism worsens climate change and precludes effective solutions. Coglanese and D'Ambrosio 8. Incremental policies worsen climate change because of leakage. They create a path dependence that prevents better alternatives and lull the public into thinking climate change is being addressed, dampening demand for comprehensive policies that achieve meaningful results. Contention 2, radicalism is necessary and effective. Radicals are responsible for major achievements in social justice. Kuttner 01. Nearly every great social justice movement was initiated by radicals. The anti-slavery movement, women's suffrage, modern feminism, unionism, civil rights, and the movement against the Vietnam War. Pure food and drugs and safe workplaces were the handiwork of radicals. Radicals push outward the boundaries of possible. Government needs pressure from radicals. Roosevelt could move left because he had mass popular movements providing the tailwind. The Kennedys and LBJ could end segregation because they had the SNCC, CORE, and MLK pressuring them. And empirics show that a radical flank is necessary for any social justice movement to succeed, Malm 20. The Civil Rights Movement won the Act of 1964 because it had a radical flank that made it appear a lesser evil. That flank was associated with Black violence. In the classic study of the radical flank effect, Herbert Haynes recaps, direct action struck at the heart of powerful interests because it could so easily turn to violence. The result was federal action designed to make protests unnecessary. Over the course of the 60s, the benchmark of moderation shifted rapidly as radicals of yesteryear came to look reasonable next to the threat of revolution. The history of social movement activity suggests reforms are more likely to be achieved when activists behave in confrontational ways. And activists succeeded in women's suffrage and ending apartheid, Malm 20. The suffragettes' tactic of choice was property destruction, sending hundreds of women down streets to smash every window they passed. In 1960, the ANC realized they had to ratchet up pressure. Mandela said our strategy was to make forays against military targets that would frighten supporters and weaken the economy. Commando units in apartheid struck against property, and the actions had a rousing effect on the masses who saw that resistance was possible and streamed into the ANC. And with that, I affirm, and I now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay, is my opponent and judges all ready for cross-ex?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I'll start on your value criterion of minimizing oppression. How do we determine what the minimum amount of oppression is?
Sure, so the goal isn't to say what the minimum amount of oppression is. Obviously, that would be a state of total equality. We're trying to get as close to social justice, which is the state of equality, as possible, which is what the affirmative is achieving.
Okay, what definition do you read that says social justice is a state of equality?
Sure, I can read you my definition again if you would like of social justice.
That's fine. On the definitions, you talk about how radicalism includes a bunch of ideas, but then you also talk about how it's a method of sweeping change. Will you defend radicalism as an ideology or method?
Sure, so I talk about radical actions in my case, right? I talk about the civil rights movement as a radical protest movement that leads to radical actions and concessions from the government. I'm defending radicalism as these forms of actions and as well as the beliefs of these movements in society, such as the civil rights movement.
Okay, so the beliefs of something like the civil rights movement is also radicalism, not just the action of protest.
Well, I would refer you to my definition of radicalism, where I define that's a political doctrine advocating for sweeping political change. Obviously, this encompasses both an ideology and the actions associated with it.
Okay, we'll move to your contention. The first thing you talk about is the abolition of slavery. What was the radicalism that enabled the 13th Amendment to be passed?
Sure, we look to the radical Republicans in Congress, which only occurred after the Civil War was fought. Radical Republicans were not willing to compromise with the South. They demanded that the 13th Amendment be passed in all states in order for readmission into the Union. This was the radical action that followed after the Civil War, a fundamentally radical state as well.
Okay, so when talking about the 13th Amendment, we see that before it there were abolition of slavery in specific territories and then the Emancipation Proclamation. Why is this not the gradual process that you define as incrementalism?
Yes, because I tell you that incrementalism on slavery led to it expand for hundreds of years. You may say that some individual territories used incrementalism, but overall the incrementalism of slave codes, for instance, saying that slave owners could only whip their slaves a certain amount of time, led slavery to expand across the country because it made it seem less bad than it truly was.
Okay, when you talk about climate change, can you read me a piece of evidence that suggests a policy that is radical?
Yeah, sure. So I can refer you to my evidence that I read you on the Kaplan and Dennis card, which says that coal use needs to be eliminated within 30 years and switch to decarbonization.
Okay, is there evidence, or does that piece of evidence conclude that just eliminating coal use is capable of solving climate change?
Yes, I'm not talking about just eliminating coal use. Obviously, there's tons of radical actions that could be pursued. This would depend on what these radical protest movements are calling for. Coal use being eliminated and decarbonization, eliminating oil use to fall below 60%. That is going to solve for these impacts of climate change, as is specifically what the scientists recommend to do is decarbonization.
Okay, no further questions. Okay, before I begin, I also have some thank yous that I would like to make. First, to both the NSDA and the Kentucky Host Committee for putting on such a great tournament. Also, a thank you to my school and school district for helping us get around to tournaments and for supporting programs at all 5 of our high schools to encourage our participation in excellence and debate. A massive thank you to my parents and the rest of my family for the support. I know it's annoying that I'm always at debate, and even more annoying that the 3 hours I spend at home a week are researching why aliens existing is epistemically good. I really appreciate your support through all of that. There's way too many people that have helped me get here as a debater to thank all of you by name, but I'll get as many as I can. First, the entire East debate team for always helping me prep and always helping make prep fun. More broadly, the students and coaches of Olathe North, South, and Northwest for being just as supportive and helpful despite having zero obligation to do so. Thank you to my lab mates and lab leaders from camps, and I'd also just like to generally shout out the whole Kansas circuit for both policy and LD. There's no way it'd be as good as I would if you weren't so challenging and competitive. Specifically for this tournament, thanks to Quinn and Sean for all of your hours of prep getting me through NAT quals, and to Kaylin, Grant, Hudson, Will, and Sohail for y'all's help prepping before and during this tournament. Shout out to the Kansas Coalition with Lawrence, Wichita East, St. Thomas, Lansing, and also the random people from Louisville and California who we found and whose names I never got for helping scout and prep throughout this tournament. Lastly, thank you to Brett, Audie, Tegan, and Ariana, who are all super influential and who I became as a debater in person. I can't overstate your impact enough. And finally, thanks to all my coaches, especially Kraus, helping me to greatly improve as a debater and as a student, and to Goddard for being so helpful with getting me into and started with debate, and for all the work you do with this team for fundraising, to paperwork, to hosting tournaments, and everything else in between. Finally, I thank all of you for sitting through that boring list of names, and credits to Connor for coming up with that line. I'm now ready to begin whenever my judges are. I negate resolved. Radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice. First, some definitions. The American Radicalism Collection defines radicalism as actions of groups who advocate thorough or complete reform. This means radicalism is a method of complete change. It does not include ideologies like my opponent defines it. You should prefer this for two reasons. First, it has an intent to define. It's the definition given as a guide for the history of radicalism. B is that my definition creates a method versus method debate. You should prefer this to radicalism as an idea, which forces us to compare a method and an idea which can't be done. Second, the Free Dictionary defines preferable as more desirable than another. This means the affirmative must prove radicalism is better than incrementalism, so proving the two are equal successfully negates. On the value and criterion, my value is progress, defined by dictionary.com as movement toward a goal. You should prefer progress as the value. Social justice is not something we do or can perfectly have, so the key is to make change in the right direction. And the value criterion, or how to achieve the value, is consequentialism, defined by Oxford Languages as the doctrine that the morality of an action is to be judged solely by its consequences. You should prefer consequentialism as the criterion. Intent to progress is irrelevant, only the results tell us if we made progress. Additionally, prefer this to their criterion of minimizing oppression, because doing this requires calculations of what oppression is. This necessitates comparing different forms of oppression, which results in oppression Olympics that harms intersectional resistance. With that, I'll move on to my contention of sustainability. Incrementalism is best. It limits opportunity and scope of mistakes while enabling us to bypass modern political gridlock. Adam et al. 21. Lindblom rejected designing policy from the ground up and argued a method which continually builds solutions by small degrees was far superior. Decision makers suffer from cognitive limitations. Mistakes will be inevitable. Non-incremental policy are unpredictable. A process of trial and error helps limit the potential for large mistakes. Effective policy can be identified while policy errors can be corrected. Agreeing on small policy is superior to large reforms that cannot find the majority. Opponents with different values hardly agree on principles, yet agree on specific policies. Political trends are enhancing the attractiveness of incrementalism. Political polarization affect the need and difficulty to strike compromise. Political inaction is hardly an attractive strategy. And radicalism is unstable. It reinvigorates radicalism on the other side, which, absent incremental change, culminates in civil war. Applebaum 20. In a moment of rising political hysteria, radicalism will spread on the right as well as the left, a form of negative politics called cumulative extremism. Both blame the other. The radicalization was mutually reinforcing. Remaining neutral became impossible. Radicalism accelerated because violence normalized more violence. If Biden fails, it is unlikely people will decide that Trump is right. They are likely to move further to the extremes. Cumulative extremism subsided in one of two ways. It can culminate in a full-scale civil war. Alternatively, it can end thanks to the emergence of moderate forces. And even if they're right that radical change is needed, incremental change is the best way to accomplish it. Gapel 16. Radicalness and purpose should not be revolution. Radicalness and purpose is holding a vision that stirs up energy and taking incremental steps required to get there. Declaring a radical purpose requires intense work. Seeking to change a system too swiftly or drastically creates self-defensive, destabilizing reactions. System innovation entails finding the right steps at the right time. The radical purpose informs incremental interventions. It is easier to focus on discontinuing a few root causes and observing new dynamics that allow reorganizing. With that, I'll move on to my opponent's case. First, a top-level framing issue. Winning one instance of good radicalism doesn't affirm the resolution. The team who best defends their side true as a general principle wins. Prefer this for fairness. Anything else means teams cherry-pick obscure instances so the other side can't negate, which creates a race to the bottom and destroys clash. Second, prefer it for jurisdiction. NSDA guidelines check one instance framing. It's their topic and tournament, which means we're obligated to oblige. NSDA 21. Each debater has to prove their side valid as a general principle. It is unrealistic to prove complete validity. The better debater proves their side more valid as a general principle. With that, I'll move on to their specific arguments. First, they talk about both the abolition of slavery and civil rights movement. It's worth noting that the radicalism that led to abolition was the secession of the South. They talk about how it was actually the radical Republicans, but the only reason that they were able to pass such radical policy is because the South had seceded. Absent this instance of radicalism, which was obviously bad, there would never have been a 13th Amendment. Second of all, you should be voting neg on this question, because the movement for civil rights was incremental. The struggle for civil rights was not all at once, but multiple small policies over time. Longley 20. Whether recognized as such or not, incrementalism resulted in civil rights. The 14th Amendment guaranteed black people equal protection. The 15th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination and racial segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy test to vote. The Fair Housing Act ensured equal housing opportunity. With that, I'll move on to their climate contention. First, I would make two arguments as to why incrementalism is preferable to address climate change. The first is smokescreen. Climate is a hot-button partisan issue. Political deadlock prevents sweeping climate action, but obscured incremental reforms like subsidizing electric cars pass with bipartisan support. It's slow action or no action. Second is electability. Radical climate action spikes energy prices, which increases backlash and decreases electoral prospect. Detner 21. Leaders committed to net zero emissions may discover a high electoral price to pay. Energy prices have hit a 7-year high. Stockpiles are dwindling. Voters won't see cheaper post-fossil energy for some time. Now they are just seeing higher costs caused by the energy squeeze. The energy price crisis will prompt a backlash against net zero policies. Radical climate action will be complicated and hard. Now I'll enter their argument that radicalism is good because it leads to more support. First, this concedes that incrementalism is the method of change for radical ideas, which is a reason to vote neg. Second of all, the radical flank effect is wrong. Their studies are flawed. Violence is worse for nonviolent movements. Peace Science Digest in 16. There is no relationship between violent flanks and nonviolent campaign success. Negative and positive effects cancel each other out. Participation is the strongest determinant of success, and violent flanks have a negative effect on participation. Authorities use armed actors to justify widespread repression. Previous scholarship has been inconclusive as studies focus on individual cases. Authors set out to bring clarity. Examining the full universe of campaigns from 1900 until 2006, there was greater evidence for negative flank effect mechanisms than positive ones. And finally, there's a spectacle turn. Arguing that violence against protesters is good because it generates sympathy is problematic. Letting the oppressed bleed so that the white moderates can see it objectifies marginalized groups, which leads to net more violence. With all of this considered, I negate the resolution and open myself to cross-examination.
All right, are my judges ready for cross-examination? Is my opponent ready?
Yes.
All right, then in that case, I will begin my time now. So you cite this backlash effect on the negative case, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the abolition of slavery caused a pretty big backlash, right?
Yes.
So should we not have abolished slavery to avoid that backlash?
Sure. So the argument is that the backlash created ends up being net worse. We would
Okay, so in the case of slavery, was the backlash net worse than actually abolishing slavery?
I would say in that specific instance, no.
Okay,
For that,
so let's move on. The Civil Rights Act caused a pretty big backlash, right?
The Civil Rights Act didn't have as much backlash once the policy was enacted. The backlash was more so directed at the movement, but once it had legal backing, then it was more accepted.
Okay, so are you arguing that radicalism was successful in the case of the Civil Rights Act, and that didn't produce a backlash?
I am arguing that the incremental change that was implemented as a result of it is what led to acceptance of the norms.
Okay, and so are you saying there was no backlash to the Civil Rights Act?
I'm saying that the backlash to the Civil Rights Act was negligible compared to the backlash to the radical movement for it at large.
All right, do you think it was negligible to have police dogs attacking black protesters in the streets arguing for the Civil Rights Movement?
Yes, that is the radical movement where there was backlash against it. But after the Civil Rights Act, the policy that was incremental was passed, there was less backlash to that, and there was more acceptance.
Sure. So you're saying the policy was incremental, but you can see that the activists fighting for it were radical, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then if the policy is actually enacted by radicals, how can it be incremental?
Because the policy was enacted through compromise in a congressional setting. My
right.
long evidence talks about how this is incremental.
Okay, are you saying incrementalism is when you compromise on things?
Incrementalism includes compromise, but the most distinct is that it is gradual change towards a large goal,
Sure,
which the Civil Rights Act was.
And so what was the compromise on the Civil Rights Act? Do you think that like the Southern racists in Congress were compromising with the civil rights activists in order to produce it?
Yes, there had to have been compromise, otherwise it wouldn't have been able to be passed. The only instance of radicalism that didn't require compromise is your abolition example, and that's only because the South had seceded to enable that compromise policy to pass.
Sure, so let's say, what would you cite as an example of a radical policy then, if you're saying all policies are incremental since they require compromise?
Sure. I'm saying that an example of a radical policy is something that leads to the extreme change all at once. My Longley evidence in the
Okay, yeah, so I was asking you for an example of one of those.
Yes, it's not my job to provide examples of radical policy.
Okay, so do you think there are any radical policies, or are you saying that by definition radical policies can't exist because it requires compromise?
No, there are examples of radical policy.
Okay,
it would be a policy that results in extreme change.
Yes, but you can't provide me an
job,
example of one.
It would be the affirmative's job to provide examples for their side.
All right.
Just negating.
So you're saying there are some, you're just not going to provide me with any examples?
Yes.
Okay, sure. All right, and so for the order of the affirmative speech, I will be going over the affirmative side, and then I'll go over the negative side. And are all my judges ready? And is my opponent ready? Okay, then I will begin my 4 minutes starting now. So on the affirmative side, my opponent says one instance doesn't prove. Well, I agree. That's why I gave you multiple instances. I gave you climate change, slavery, racial discrimination, feminism, workers' rights, and apartheid. Then prefer my criterion of minimizing oppression. Only my criterion tells us which consequences to weigh. In responses, my opponent says it leads to oppression in Olympics, but we're not pitting oppressed groups against one another. We're aiming to eliminate oppression overall throughout society. Liberating one group doesn't come at the expense of the other. And they extend subpoint A that incrementalism allowed the expansion of slavery and only radical action solved this unjust system. In response, he says there was radicalism on the side of the South, but he actually concedes my point that radicalism was needed to end slavery through the example of the Civil War in order to abolish it. He doesn't defend incrementalism in this case, and he drops my card that shows that incrementalism made the issue worse. Slave codes allowed for the expansion of slavery as these failed compromises. He says the civil rights movement was incremental. That is fundamentally untrue. There was no progress until radical activists like MLK, who called for the fierce urgency of the now, who spoke out against the white moderates, who spoke out against the tranquilizing drug of incrementalism, started taking radical action in the streets and fighting for justice. Radical activists are the ones who create change, and to say the Civil Rights Act is incremental is insulting to those activists. It fundamentally restructured society and defined the basis of discrimination to eliminate it from public institutions. Extend subpoint B that incrementalism creates a false appearance of change, allowing climate change to worsen, and we need radical action to prevent millions of deaths. He says gridlock stops climate change action, but that's because there's no radical movement right now pushing for it. That's what the affirmative is recommending. And gridlock exists in the status quo with incrementalism. What progress have we made on climate change through incrementalism? He provides no solvency and no specific evidence. And he then talks about energy prices increasing, but first he assumes radical policies are enacted, so I get the benefits of that, and I'm solving for climate change, solving for those millions of deaths. And then secondly, energy prices will go up as a result of climate change. We need to solve climate change in order to stop energy prices from going up. Those economic consequences far outweigh. Extend cut number 1 that radicals are responsible for all major social changes throughout history. He says if it's incremental action, then the process leading up to that doesn't matter. But he's conceding that radicalism is necessary for any incremental change to occur in the first place. Radicalism is a prerequisite to incrementalism. And extend Mom 20, a radical flank is necessary for success. He says violence is worse for nonviolent movements. That's empirically disproven through the study. When the Black Panthers showed up in the civil rights movement, MLK got more funding because he looked like a moderate in comparison. Moving on to the negative side of the flow. He says I have to advocate for actions. First of all, he miscites that card. It says the beliefs or actions of individuals in that evidence. Second of all, we are arguing for radical action. Moving on, he says incrementalism limits the scopes of mistakes. Yes, I agree, it does, by not doing anything on the major issues that matter. He says incrementalism corrects policy errors, but he thinks our government is run by Aristotle. It's not. It's run by Mitch McConnell. He's not focusing on correcting policy errors. When errors occur, he just denies that they exist, and we don't see this happen in the real world. He cites no specific evidence or examples. He talks about backlash. We'll turn this. Backlash actually helps the movement. Look at how MLK used pictures of dogs attacking protesters to gain sympathy from moderates. Second of all, he's arguing that we shouldn't make any change because there will be a backlash. He's arguing for continued oppression. Third, none of these backlashes make it worse. The backlash of BLM didn't put Black people in a worse situation than they were before the movement when they were being slaughtered by police. Third, backlash occurs with incremental change as well. Look at the invisible backlash to something like critical race theory. And fourth, we've never seen this lead to a civil war that is empirically false. The only time when it did was when a civil war was justified. That was the example of the Civil War, when it was the only way that we could abolish slavery in America. He's saying radicalism will lead to the state of chaos, but this is untrue because radicalism on the other side, at best, is only going to help the affirmative, and at worst, it has no impact in this route. He has to prove solvency for the issues I bring up because he provides no impacts on the negative case, and he has no specific evidence on that front. And for those reasons, I urge the affirmative.
Okay, are all my judges ready? Is my opponent ready? And for a quick order, I will be going over definitions, the value and criterion, the negative case, and the affirmative case. My opponent makes a lot of seemingly compelling points in their last speech, but ultimately, the 1AR doesn't resolve some key issues, which means that you're voting negative for 3 reasons in today's debate. First, incrementalism is the only method that can achieve change. Second, radicalism is net worse for social justice. And third, the affirmative is behind on all of their possible 2AR voting issues. On the definitions debate, I'll agree with my opponent that radicalism can include both the method and the idea. The problem is that the idea itself can't achieve anything, but relies on incremental change, which I'll win on my case level. And on the value and value criterion, I will concede to my opponent's criterion of minimizing oppression. I will prove that incrementalism is the best way to do this because only it can lead to material changes that improve lives. To see why that is, we'll move on to the negative contention. The first reason that you're voting negative today is because incrementalism is the only method to achieve change. This is because of compromise as per my Adam evidence. Changing people's overarching values is unrealistic and leads to endless gridlock, but people are able to agree on specific policy interventions. For example, there are queer feminists, Blackist feminists, Marxist feminists, etc., who despite having fundamentally different worldviews can all get behind protecting Roe v. Wade. The need for compromise is further exacerbated by modern political polarization, which means that the options are slow action or no action. There's 2 reasons you're voting on this argument. A, the resolution asks what best achieves social justice. No matter how good their ideals of radicalism are, this argument proves the only way we can see actual real-world changes needed to achieve social justice is with incrementalism. B, it means that incrementalism best meets the criterion, because it accomplishes reducing oppression because that requires structures being changed, which is done through incremental policy and not sentiments and idea alone. There's a couple answers here, but none of them are very good. The only answer on the compromise warrant specifically is that it extended slavery. First of all, this is one instance, which isn't enough to disprove the merits of incrementalism as a general principle. And second of all, this just isn't true, because there's multiple compromises that led to a reduction in slavery, like the Compromise of 1820, Kansas-Nebraska Act, or Compromise of 1850. They'll also probably make this argument that there won't be incremental changes because of political polarization and gridlock. But this specifically answers this argument, because the evidence talks about how in light of modern political polarization, we won't be able to get people to change their overarching values, but we can still them to agree on specific policies. This is a net reason to prefer incrementalism because it's better for that issue. The second reason that you're voting negative today is because radicalism is net worse for social justice. This is because of backlash as per my Gopel evidence. Radical movements demand sweeping change, but the people in power aren't just going to sit there and take it. Governments respond to radicalism with oppressive policy or military force. There's tons of examples. Abolition of slavery led to segregation, gender nonconformity has led to a new wave of transphobic bills, and the military was sent in against the Black Panthers and Zapatistas. This means their attempt at radicalism results in violence, repression, or both. You're voting on this argument for 2 reasons. A, it proves radicalism is unable to achieve social justice because their movements are always shut down before they can make long-lasting changes. You can't make radical changes if you're in jail or shot. B, radicalism doesn't meet the value. It does the opposite of reducing oppression because the policies and police intervention it generates are new instances of structural violence. Their only answer here is this turn, that backlash helps because it makes moderates more supportive to the movement, citing this MLK example. But there's a dropped spectacle turn from the NC about why this framing is uniquely bad and violent. Saying that it's good for people protesting for justice to get beaten up so that white moderates are more sympathetic to their cause just objectifies them and essentially reduces their role to punching bags, which just justifies more violence against them in the long term. They also make this argument that this isn't true because the other option is continued oppression. That's not true at all. The other option is incrementalism, and I just proved to you why that's better. The last argument they make is that incrementalism also gets backlash, citing critical race theory. There's no explanation of why critical race theory is incremental. If anything, a radical re-understanding of how we evaluate history is probably radicalism and just proved my claim true. The final reason that you're voting for the negative today is because none of the possible 2AR options are going to be won by them. First, there's the one instance framing that they don't have a good answer to. They just say that they have multiple examples, but that drops this debate is about proving the resolution true as a general principle. Even if they win the climate change, civil rights, or any of their examples, that doesn't prove radicalism is theoretically good. This is conceded, and it means that there's only one route to the ballot, which is their radical flank effect argument, that radicalism is what enables moderate changes. The problem is they're behind on two key arguments here. First, proving that radical movements enables incremental change just proves that incrementalism is what achieves the social justice. Even if radicalism is a precondition, it's not the one actually achieving social justice, and it needs incrementalism to do so, which is a reason to prefer. Second is that their argument about the radical flank effect is wrong. That's my Peace Science Digest 16 evidence that talks about how in a study of all nonviolent movements, from 1900 to 2006, they concluded that the negative effects outweighed the positive. They just answer this with the example of MLK, but this evidence literally indicts that and says other studies have cherry-picked specific examples like the affirmative is doing. The radical flank effect is wrong. My opponent is going to make some compelling points in the next speech, or they wouldn't be this far. But ultimately, they've left the unresolved questions that incrementalism is the only method to solve through compromise, radicalism cannot solve because of backlash, and their only route to the ballot is being won by the affirmative, so you'll be voting negative today.
Is everyone ready for the last affirmative rebuttal? Okay, is my opponent ready? All right, so for the off-time roadmap, I will be going over the 3 reasons to vote affirmative, then I'll go on the affirmative impacts, and then I'll go on the negative impacts. All right, in that case, we have our 3 minutes starting now. There are 3 reasons to vote affirmative. The first is that we are the only side with specific evidence and specific solvency for this round. The negative offers no solvency for any of the impacts in the debate. He just speaks in these vague platitudes about a perfect world where everyone learns from policy errors and compromises on issues. He has a false view of how change occurs. Oppressors never hand down rights to the oppressed. They have to be demanded by radical activists. That's how we have incremental change in the first place. Second voting issue is that all real change comes from activists forcing concessions. This is a radical flank argument, and I give you multiple historical examples, all of which were dropped. From the suffragettes, ending apartheid, the civil rights, etc., union rights. And then the third issue is that incrementalism preserves the status quo and allows for these issues to worsen and expand. Moving on to the affirmative side, first of all, my opponent argues that compromises led to a reduction in slavery. This is completely false. All of these compromises allowed slavery to remain and expand. The Compromise of 1820 further entrenched the system. And he drops my argument about how MLK was a radical activist, and it was radical activists who created incremental change. He'll say, well, it was incremental change in the end, so the radicalism doesn't matter. But what I'm showing you is that radicalism is a prerequisite for any change to occur at all. And the second main issue is that the negative drops climate change as a whole. He drops my card telling you that incrementalism makes climate change worse. I tell you that through the lulling effect. And he drops my card that leads to millions of deaths. The affirmative is the only one with specific solvency on this issue, where I tell you that we need radical action in order to end climate change. That is what all scientists say on this issue. He has no specific evidence on this front, and this is outweighing on magnitude and scope for any minor backlash effect that he finds, which I've already disproven. You'll accept my historical examples, almost all were dropped, and the radical flank effect. He says he has this study, but then he provides us with no examples from this study. He's just saying there's empirical evidence and then never justifying it. I show you how that's false. The Black Panthers led to an increase in funding for more moderates like MLK by shifting the Overton window. Now let's move on to the negative side of the case. He drops lots of ground on here. He drops my point about how he thinks our government is run by these perfect, rational people. Policy errors are never corrected in the status quo. He doesn't give you a single example of that. He drops my argument about how incrementalism limits mistakes by making no changes. And he makes his new argument about blaming gender non-conforming people for anti-trans bills. This is victim blaming at its finest, and this is untrue. He says I'm objectifying oppressed people, but that's not the case. I'm just showing how backlash doesn't have an impact in this round. And he says critical race theory is radical. That's not true as well. The point I'm making is that Republicans will invent things to create backlash too. It's not just radicalism. You can extend all my responses to the backlash effect, turning it about how MLK used it to gain sympathy. I've responded to that. Another one about how it occurs with incremental change as well, and how there's no impact in this round since we're only weighing on my impacts. What comes down to is that slavery was the biggest issue of our time. We tried incrementalism and it made it worse. It further entrenched it. Now climate change is the biggest issue. We have to do what we know works, and that's radical action. Vote affirmative.
At this time, please welcome the 1st through 14th speakers to the stage, and the 7th through 14th place winners in Lincoln Douglas debate presented by Western Kentucky University to the holding area. 1st through 14th speakers to the stage.
Just takes time.
right there. Congratulating today's semifinalists is Executive Director, Mr. J. Scott Watton. It is all about you.
Okay, so at this time, we welcome 1st through 14th speakers to the stage. Your 1st through 14th speaker in Lincoln Douglas debate are, in 14th place, Shalu Pillai from Granite Bay High School in California, coached by Robert Pritchard. In 13th place, Greta Weedle from Longmont High School in Colorado, coached by Jim Dornan. In 12th place, Hannah Owens Pierre from Edina High School in Minnesota, coached by Mark Kivamaki and Joe Smith. In 11th place, Connor Clark from Tempe Preparatory Academy in Arizona, coached by Danielle Delgado. In 10th place, Paxton Shepard from Rigby High School in Idaho, coached by Brock Sondrup. In 9th place, Benjamin Gann from Bolivar High School in Missouri, coached by Ethan Samuel. In 8th place, Molly Welch from Minnetonka High School in Minnesota, coached by Carissa Hayden. In 7th place, Shreyas Tagala from Beaver Creek High School in Ohio, coached by Brandon Kamaka. In 6th place, Sophia Avery from Chagrin Falls High School in Ohio, coached by Ken Casey and Corinne Lashley. In 5th place, Samuel Johnson Sager from Fairview High School in Colorado, coached by Christina Getty, Jake Callan, and Dot Kellner. In 4th place, Layla Hamden from Jackson High School in Ohio, coached by Katie Morgan. In 3rd place, Nicole Poltinikov from Shady Side Academy in Pennsylvania, coached by Mary Crowland. In 2nd place, Owen Tillman from Colorado Academy in Colorado, coached by Randall Martinez and John Vogels. In 1st place and receiving $500 scholarship presented by the Tina Wang Memorial Scholarship and Charitable Foundation, your top LD debate speaker, Easton Logback from Olathe East High School in Kansas, coached by Stacy Goddard and Kevin Krause.
At this time, please welcome the 7th through 14th place winners in Lincoln Douglas debate presented by Western Kentucky University to the stage. 7th through 14th place winners in Lincoln Douglas debate presented by Western Kentucky University to the stage.
Your 7th through 14th place winners in Lincoln Douglas debate are, in a three-way unbreakable tie for 14th place, Leon Shep Carew from Norman North High School in Oklahoma, coached by Morgan Russell and Lori Crawford. Tied for 14th place, Vincent Huang from Syosset High School, coached by Lydia Esslinger from the state of New York. Also tied for 14th place, Shruti Narayana Bhatla from Ridge High School in New Jersey, coached by David Jastrzymski, Daniel Norris, and Anthony Cervantz. In 13th place, Sophia Avery from Chagrin Falls High School in Ohio, coached by Ken Casey and Corinne Lashley. In 12th place, Connor Clark from Tempe Preparatory Academy in Arizona, coached by Danielle Delgado. In 11th place, Allie Holtz from Chagrin Falls High School in Ohio, coached by Ken Casey and Corinne Lashley. In 10th place, Roberto Sosa from Cardinal Gibbons in Florida, coached by Louise Bravum. Tied for 8th place, Samuel Johnson Sager from Fairview High School in Colorado, coached by Christina Getty, Jake Kalin, and Dot Kellner. Also tied for 8th place, Hadith Dameh from Apple Valley High School in Minnesota, coached by Nick Smith. And in 7th place, Molly Welch from Minnetonka High School in Minnesota, coached by Charissa Hayden.
Any student or team who places in the top 14 in any main event at this year's national tournament is automatically invited back to next year's national tournament in that same event. Would any of you who just completed the 9th, 10th, or 11th grade please move forward? Congratulations to our national auto qualifiers for next year.
Now, let's welcome the finalists we've had for Lincoln Douglas debate to the stage for introduction. Your finalists for 2023 in Lincoln Douglas debate. Code 490 on the affirmative, Hannah Owens Pierre from Edina High School in Minnesota, coached by Mark Kivamaki and Joe Schmidt. And code 498 on the negative, Easton Logback from Olathe East High School in Kansas, coached by Stacy Goddard and Kevin Kraus.
And I am informed that both of our debaters are underclassmen and are therefore both invited back, possibly to just repeat this debate next year at the 2023 National Championship. Would the judges who are pooled for the public forum debate presented by the Arthur N. Roop Foundation please find their way to the front table? Judges for Arthur N. Roop Foundation Public Forum Debate.